Okay, sorry, I had to break that video up. I got a phone call, of all things. So anyway, so now we're talking about other sampling techniques that work that aren't necessarily simple, random, stratified, or systematic, but that have some characteristics to them that are still useful and used fairly commonly. So we wanted to go over those. So a cluster sample. Cluster sample is a sample of a small collection that is localized geographically by some other means in the hopes that the cluster is still representative of the population as a whole. So the example I always like to use is, let's say I work with McDonald's Canada. I want to survey employees to see how happy they are at their particular locations. And McDonald's is a franchised company, so that means that all the different restaurants are owned by different people, sometimes multiple restaurants, but either way. And so the management's done a little bit differently, but there's an overall corporate structure. So if I wanted to survey McDonald's, what I would want to do is randomly choose restaurants, okay, in different regions, wherever it may be. And when I randomly choose restaurants in different regions, then what I do is I sample everybody in that restaurant. So rather than choosing one or two people from every restaurant across Canada, which is very difficult to do, what I do is I choose one restaurant, in different regions in Ontario, and then I sample the whole restaurant and hope that the people in the restaurant are representative of every other restaurant that's out there in that region. So let's say, I don't know, in Toronto, let's say there's 300 McDonald's. Okay, I would pick 3 or 5 or 10 of those individual restaurants, and rather than sample one person from every single restaurant, I would take of those 5 restaurants from the whole that are in all of Toronto, and I'd sample everybody in that restaurant. I'd get the same number of people, but that cluster that I choose, hopefully, even if it's chosen randomly, is representative of how all of the McDonald's restaurants are being run. And that may or may not be the case, but there's some pluses and minuses to the strategy. You hope that your clusters are representative, but it's certainly way less expensive, way less time consuming, way easier to administer, and hopefully still representative and random enough that it would represent how everybody's feeling of all the employees in McDonald's. And that's sort of a good idea there. A multi-stage is often confused with a cluster sample because it is kind of a cluster. But a multi-stage means that things are chosen at multiple stages until you get down to a size of a sample that is reasonable. So, an example, rather than choosing all the McDonald's restaurants, I'm going to talk about choosing a particular school to survey. And a school size of 1,000 people, say, is what's appropriate. So what I would do is I would say, okay, I'm the Ministry of Education in Ontario. So what I would do is I would break it into regions, right? And not in school board regions. Those are big. But, like Northern Ontario, Southern Ontario, Southwestern Ontario, Southeastern Ontario, whatever regions I want to do. And I'd randomly choose one of those. Okay, so let's say there's 4 regions that they choose. Okay, and then they break it down to Southwestern Ontario, which is where we are. Okay, that's the first stage of sampling. Then what they would do is in that region is they would look at all the school boards that are in that region, Catholic and public. Okay, and then what they would do is they would then randomly sample the school boards. And boop, they would get, for example, randomly they choose Dufferin Peel. Okay, and then once they have Dufferin Peel, they say to themselves, well, still, it's too big of a sample. You've got grade schools and high schools and stuff like that. I want high school students. So you decide to choose the high school, but then you go, okay, you take all the high schools that are in Dufferin Peel, and then you randomly choose one high school. And let's say, boop, it turns up to be St. Roch, which is where our summer school is based, or Loyola, where my home school is based, or wherever the night school is that I'm at. But they choose that one site. Okay, and then what they do is they sample that whole site. So it's kind of like a cluster sample, but it's actually been chosen in multiple levels. Okay, and so there's some similarities and differences between those. Again, you hope that the demographics of that school is representative of the entire population of Ontario, and so on and so forth. But it sort of depends how it all works out. Okay, so there's pluses and minuses to that. Another example of a survey that's very commonly used is a voluntary response sample. Now, a voluntary response sample is wrought with bias. Okay, and it's got a big type of bias called non-response bias. Okay, because you're not getting responses from all kinds of individuals, only from the people who want to respond. Okay, and so voluntary response samples would be examples of, you call people up randomly and they'd ask them to answer a survey, or I don't know, you buy a product and they've got a little customer satisfaction survey in there, and they say, oh, we'll give you a free this or free that if you fill out the survey or whatever it may be. And then you just sort of keep on getting people to come in and to respond to a sample in that way. Okay, and that's an example of a voluntary response sample where people literally just, if they're interested, they volunteer. If they're not interested, they don't volunteer. The last type of sample is a convenience sample. And a convenience sample is a sample that's just literally taken with no real strategy in mind. If I was to look at, high school students, and I want to talk about teenage high school students, I would just randomly sample I would randomly sample our classroom. Now, our classroom is a convenience sample because it's all there right in front of me. You're a captive audience and you have to do it. So our survey that we do at the beginning of this unit is an example of a convenience sample. If I want to talk about the population of individuals in high schools, it's not grade 9s, not grade 10s, maybe some grade 11s, mostly grade 12s. It's wrought with bias. It's an academic university level course. There's all kinds of different biases that are associated with that. Okay, so that's an example of a convenience sample. So read over that section in your textbook, answer some of these questions, and hopefully that makes sense to you.